From October 2nd to 4th, 2020, the American Institute for Economic Research hosted a small conference for scientists to discuss the COVID-19 lockdowns.
We need to approach this problem from so many different dimensions. We need to do what humans do, which is make very complex decisions on a very complicated landscape of risks and costs and benefits. And we've done that all along with all the risks we face, including those that arise from other infectious diseases. And somehow this event has plunged us into a crisis where we can't do it anymore. We can't find that equilibrium anymore.
Just 4 days later, Dr. Francis Collins, the retiring director of the National Institutes of Health, NIH, would call the three of the scientists in attendance fringe epidemiologists, in a directive he sent to Anthony Fauci and other senior staff of his agency.
Why, there's a guitar right here. How about that? This is a song where the tune will be familiar to you, unless you came from another planet recently. But the words are going to be quite different, because this is really a song for you, a song for all of us who've been going through this pandemic and trying to imagine, how's it going to feel when we're finally past that? What will that be like? We're going to get there, and you're going to help us get there. So that's what this is about.
They were fringe epidemiologists because they had the temerity to ask whether the lockdowns of 2020 were effective. Those three, Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, Sunetra Gupta of Oxford, and Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, were simply doing what any good scientist would do. They were following the evidence. They wrote the Great Barrington Declaration as they parted company at AIER, posting it for all to see. So why was Dr. Collins so intent on impunging these three scientists? It's hard to know exactly, mostly because any scientist worth his salt should have been happy to see further research being done. That is, after all, how ignorance is replaced by knowledge. But Collins was clearly in no mood to replace his own possible ignorance with any kind of knowledge. He was pretty sure he knew all he had to know, and this is one of the most dangerous positions a scientist can take.
Poof, coronavirus came from overseas, infecting folks across the land, Seattle, NYC. A little bats virus.
In an email obtained by AIER through a Freedom of Information Act request, Collins told Anthony Fauci that he wanted a quick and devastating published takedown of the Great Barrington Declaration's premises. Hi, Tony and Cliff. See gbddeclaration.org. This proposal from the three fringe epidemiologists who met with the secretary seemed to be getting a lot of attention, and even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner Michael Leavitt at Stanford. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway?
Schools
Francis.
are closed, all kids must know, avoid the danger zones. We all must do our part to protect the ones we love. So if you meet at least 6 feet and handle doors with gloves, oh, poof, coronavirus came from overseas.
Well, about 7 or 8 months ago, AIER submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Institutes of Health to try to find documentation and correspondence on how they responded to the Great Barrington Declaration, which was the petition that was signed at AIER last October by three very well-known, eminently qualified doctors and epidemiologists making the case against lockdowns. And we knew this thing had gone viral in the media, and we knew it was brought up in several of the discussions before our public health agencies. So we were trying to find out what was said and what was done, several months after the fact, which turned into a year after the fact. So on Friday, we received an email that contained the very first set of public record releases in response to this request. And it turned out it had correspondence between Anthony Fauci, who we all know from television, and his boss, Francis Collins, who's the director, or was until this weekend, the director of the National Institutes for Health. And 3 days after the Great Barrington Declaration came out, Collins emailed Fauci to direct him to basically run a smear campaign against the three scientists who authored the Great Barrington Declaration. Collins called them fringe scientists, and his direction was to do a very quick, quote, takedown of those scientists because they were contradicting the NIH's endorsed policy of lockdowns.
Wow, this is huge. We know that these are eminent scientists as well.
Absolutely.
Right? They have massive credentials.
So you had three scientists that came to AIER were from Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford universities. Collins even admits in the email, he says also, well, they also have a Nobel Prize winner who's joined with them, Michael Levitt. And he's referring to this as it's gaining steam, but you have three scientists from Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford, plus a Nobel Prize winner, and the NIH director is calling them fringe.
Wow. And how did Fauci respond to this director?
Well, Fauci responds immediately by starting to collect articles to rebut the Great Barrington Declaration. And he sends Collins, within a few minutes of getting this directive to take down the scientists, he sends Collins an email that contains an article from Wired magazine, not a scientific publication. This is like a tech gadget magazine. And the reporter is like a guy with a undergraduate degree in journalism. And it was an article attacking the Great Barrington Declaration. But the funny thing about this article is not just that it was a pop media op-ed source. It's not a scientific refutation at all. It also has one of the worst predictions or claims of any media outlet that's come out in the entire pandemic. Remember, this is October 2020. The writer for Wired magazine says the problem with the Great Barrington Declaration is it's arguing with the past. Lockdowns are behind us. That was a policy from March 2020, and we aren't going back into lockdowns, so why do we need this petition? And this is Anthony Fauci saying, this is the talking point we want to use to rebut the Great Barrington Declaration. Well, as we all know, what happened less than a month later, the UK went into full lockdown. Several other European countries copied them. Several U.S. states went back into lockdown for the winter 2020 wave.
So in a way, they're just refuting something, saying, there's no potential of going back into lockdown, so there's nothing to refute here. And in reality, that's the opposite of what happened. So there was no basis for any factual claims here.
So we know that scientific disagreement occurs. In fact, it's the essence of science is to debate matters that we don't have a complete answer on. But Fauci's attack was not based on scientific disagreement. He already formed an opinion that the Great Barrington Declaration was wrong because it questioned lockdowns. So he went on an immediate offensive to try to discredit and smear the scientists themselves rather than engaging their arguments. And this is what we see. This is why he turns to political op-eds in venues such as Wired first. The next one he goes to was a message in the far-left magazine, The Nation, from another Yale University professor whose attack on the Great Barrington Declaration was not so much a disagreement with the science. He was upset that Martin Kulldorff, one of the co-authors, had given an interview to Jacobin magazine, and he was upset with Jacobin for breaking, quote, the lockdown solidarity with other left-wing magazines. And this is the thing that Fauci draws on and sends around to the NIH staff and it says this is why we need to attack the Great Barrington Declaration. It's all political talking points, no scientific evidence that's forming Fauci's message.
And so then this actually ended up going all the way to Deborah Birx. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
A week after Collins directs Fauci to launch the smear campaign, the White House Coronavirus Task Force was scheduled to meet. This was on Friday, October 16th, 2020. And a few days before that, Fauci starts emailing Deborah Birx and Collins and copies a bunch of other people in the NIH staff. And he says, we need to be prepared to oppose the Great Barrington Declaration because they thought Scott Atlas was going to bring it up and make a push for the Trump administration to endorse the Great Barrington Declaration. Turns out Atlas wasn't doing that. It never came up at the meeting, but they were getting all of their ducks in a row to make an attack at the task force against the Great Barrington Declaration as well. So Fauci's emails back and forth with Birx are all about how to do this. There's a huge section in between some of the emails that we have that was redacted as private information. And what we think is this is probably when they're having their correspondence and discussion of what the political tactics are to use on the task force.
Yes, of course, this would be something that they would want to redact. They wouldn't want to have this information come out. And even what's already been released is quite explosive. What it indicates is that there could have been a completely different path taken in the coronavirus response.
Right. And the Great Barrington Declaration was arguing for a different path. It was saying lockdowns do not work. And I think the overwhelming evidence is that the lockdowns, in fact, do not work. They are a throwback to the Middle Ages in terms of policy, but every time they've been tried, we don't see any difference in outcomes versus states and countries that remained open throughout the lockdowns. So this was one of the major arguments of the Great Barrington Declaration is lockdowns do not work, but they do have huge social and medical and other economic costs that are associated with them and that fall disproportionately on actually poor people, on the middle class, whereas the wealthy, the Zoom class, the elite are able to ride out the lockdowns in comfort. Everyone else is burdened by them. And this is a major point of the Great Barrington Declaration. We were saying that, yes, we should consider another path because if there is a second wave, and this is, again, October 2020, we thought that a second wave was probably coming. We should consider a path that doesn't involve locking everyone in their homes because we've tried that and it doesn't work. Well, what did they do in November 2020 onwards? They just resumed and they repeated the same lockdown approach that they had tried and failed with in the spring.
Incredible. Now, what do you think that this means moving forward, that this information has been released publicly?
So I think the next interesting thing that we find in the emails, and this is what points us in the next direction of where to look, is after the task force meeting, Fauci appears to have directed one of the NIH chief of staffs to put together another list of talking points against the Great Barrington Declaration, and he sends them an email that contains 7 op-eds from news media sources, from political editorials, not scientific journals. You know, this is Fauci, who often goes on TV and declares that I am the science and I'm above the politics. Well, no, he's clearly taking his talking points from political arguments that are coming out of the media in favor of lockdowns and against anyone that questions them, and repeating them back to the media. So it's a circular way that Fauci actually does what he calls science. It's really politics. He takes the media's talking points, summarizes them in short articles and short lists from his staff, and then he goes right back to the same news media and repeats them back to him on the news that night. So it's a really interesting way, an interesting glimpse into how the politics of the pandemic response are actually playing out inside of the NIH and these agencies that Fauci is engaging in. So I think the email release did catch them off guard. They weren't expecting these private email correspondences to be turned into public documents and the light of day to be shown on them.
They're clearly political organizations.
That's exactly it. So they're engaged in politics. And that was kind of peeking behind the curtain to see what's really happening at the NIH. And I know Francis Collins was directly asked about this email directive to smear the Great Barrington Declaration scientists the other day on Fox News. And his reaction, you can see in his facial expression when he goes on TV, he is not happy to have that question, but then he pauses and thinks about it for a second, and then he just doubles down. He just goes on the ad hominem attack. Wow. Well, that's... So he's on Fox News. He says, well, yes, I'm going to stand by that. I did write that, and they are fringe scientists. And then the most astounding thing of all, he says, if we had followed the Great Barrington Declaration's recommendations, 100,000 people would have died. And you're sitting here watching this video where he claims this on national TV, and you're thinking, has this guy been out of touch from reality for the last year? We followed his advice. We followed his policy of the lockdowns, and almost 800,000 people died anyway under those policies. They had no effect. They made no dent whatsoever. And in fact, in some cases, probably made the death toll worse when we look at things like the nursing homes.
Yeah, that's correct. And you also think about the lives lost to suicide, loss of livelihood, economic depressions are known to reduce the longevity of a person's life. And so we'll be dealing with the consequences of this likely for generations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're only facing the very beginning of a full reconciliation of the costs and harms that these politician bureaucrats have imposed upon society for the last 2 years. And with that in mind, I think sunlight is a good disinfectant. It's time to start looking at how this happened and make sure that we have measures in place to prevent it from happening again, to prevent medical bureaucrats from seizing authoritarian power and just running wild with it, not only eschewing science, not only refusing science, but waging political attacks and smear campaigns against the actual scientists who are trying to do something to alleviate this pandemic, trying to find another way out of it besides lockdowns.
And do you think that there will be any more information that will be released?
Now, the last thing I'll say, stay tuned. We're going to continue to search for public records that indicate what happened next.
Somewhere past the pandemic, when we're free, there's a life I remember full of activity. Somewhere past the pandemic, masks will come off. No more need for a nose swab every time we cough.